To you all, and thank you for tuning in to another of the Geological Society's short talks for COP26. I'm Dr. Anna Hicks, and I work at the British Geological Survey in Edinburgh. I'm a volcanologist and disaster risk reduction expert, and my role is to understand the aspects of people and places that make them vulnerable to volcanic and other geohazards, and to work together with those people to find ways to bring together scientific and local knowledge to reduce risk. One of the themes of COP26 is adaptation, loss, and damage. I wanted to share a few words about this in the context of geohazards, and perhaps leave you with some thoughts about how the geosciences might support our adaptation to climate change and disaster risk reduction more broadly. First, on loss. Sadly, it's something that has and will affect all of us in our lives. Whether it's a person, an object, a function, identity, place, even a dream. Loss can cause an overwhelming amount of emotional suffering and sometimes means that life will never quite be the same again. And so, if we can, we adapt to changing circumstances. And even though it's often extremely challenging, we find ways to move forward and recover. Yet, even though loss is something we all experience, our capacity to adapt and recover from losses strongly varies across the world. Variations exist even in our own neighbourhoods. Those that are more vulnerable are more likely to be adversely impacted by hazards and take longer to recover. So, as my first reflection from my research to date, it is clear that more effort is required to reposition those that are left out and left behind into first place, so that efforts to strengthen resilience to shocks can benefit more equally. As a volcanologist, I began my career just at the time when there was growing support within volcanology for risk reduction research that didn't solely depend on just understanding the hazard. Of course, we still work very hard to learn and understand why, when, and how volcanoes erupt in an effort to improve volcano monitoring, achieve better eruption forecasts, and assess potential hazards. But of course, hazards are only hazards when they threaten something: lives, livelihoods, infrastructure, the environment. Reducing risk is as dependent on understanding what is exposed and vulnerable to the hazard and taking steps to try and reduce it. This is, of course, not unique to volcanoes. Take any other geohazard: earthquakes, landslides, floods, for example, as well as meteorological hazards, biological hazards, and climate change. So perhaps this speaks to a further take-home message I wanted to share with you. While adapting to our changing climate and taking steps to reduce risks to its impacts may sometimes seem like an overwhelming task, there is much we already know from disaster studies, health and sustainability research about the process of actually doing this. What we as geoscientists can do is work more closely with scholars and practitioners from other areas of research, such as climate science, to share knowledge, identify common challenges, and help to implement solutions that can reduce risk to more than just one hazard. So, in my research, I'm a big advocate for community driven approaches to risk reduction. We are the custodians of the places we inhabit. We know and understand our local environment better than visitors, and often it's this local knowledge that can best inform appropriate responses and adaptations to our changing environment. Collaboration is usually critical to success, whether that be between community members themselves or with planners, policymakers, NGOs, or scientists. For example, as geoscientists, we can't change the geology, but we do understand what's beneath our feet and how that impacts what happens on the surface. So we can work together with farmers, for example, to perhaps change how we use the land, where we grow crops, how we plant them, or maybe the density of grazing animals. Another example, by understanding how water moves through and on our Earth's surface, we can adapt ways to best collect it, channel it, and manage it. In fact, there are examples of successful community management of resources such as water all over the world. Success can sometimes be attributed to the work of particular individuals, maybe availability of funds or simply good timing. But inevitably, different groups working together as a team is a factor common to many stories of adaptation to changing circumstances. And lastly, I wanted to share some thoughts about how we talk about loss, damage, and adaptation. It seems hard to talk about them collectively. After all, loss and damage have negative connotations, whereas we tend to see adaptation as a more positive, constructive change. As the United Nations defines it, a process of moderation or exploitation of beneficial opportunities. However, I think it's important to communicate both the positive and the negative in our efforts to reduce disaster risk. A few years ago, I was involved in a project called Strengthening Resilience in Volcanic Areas, or STREVA. While we were working in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, St. Vincent being an active volcanic island that began erupting again just this last year, some of the local community members felt that the younger generation of their country did not see the risk from the volcano as they did. The volcano had last erupted in 1979 and resulted in the evacuation of thousands of people and widespread loss of livelihood. Those that lived through the eruption shared concerns that the lack of experience of younger people with the volcano meant that they weren't as aware of the risk or prepared for a future eruption. The Streva project team worked with local people to record their memories of the 1979 eruption, to film them describing what they saw, felt, and heard, and how their communities responded at the time and recovered in the years that followed. Those films have helped to preserve those memories of the 1979 eruption and have been viewed thousands of times by Vincentian communities and elsewhere. Perhaps some of those stories were in people's minds as they responded to the most recent ongoing eruption. There are, of course, now new stories to tell. The Streva team took a similar approach to our research in Colombia, working with communities at risk from an eruption of Nevado del Ruiz. This volcano infamously erupted in 1985, sending enormous lahars, otherwise known as mudflows, hurtling through ravines and spreading into towns and villages around the volcano. Over 25,000 people were killed. While the contributing factors that caused the disaster were complex, ultimately poor communication was at the heart of the problems, as well as a lack of learning from previous eruptions. Back in 2015, as the 30th anniversary of the eruption loomed, engaging with a new generation that had no memory of the eruption was imperative. It was also necessary to give space for survivors to tell their stories. Talking of loss through storytelling can be cathartic, and many of the survivors, or those that have been affected by the 1985 eruption, had the need and willingness to tell their stories to help release that emotion. Just as in St. Vincent, we ensured that the participants of our intended audiences became the leading focus of the films, guiding the viewer through their experiences of an eruption, the story of recovery, and the challenges of having an active volcano as a neighbour. When the films were aired, the audience talked of their sadness and sometimes resentment, but also an overwhelming optimism and feelings of support from their community. They were relieved to not yet again see images that evoked fear of the volcano, but listen to stories of recovery, hope, and readiness. In the turbulent months of late, we have witnessed the eruption of several further volcanoes, many to have received global media attention. Often the images we see are of billowing ash clouds and rivers of lava raising homes, and audiences are whipped up by narratives around danger, death, and destruction. Such negative framings of disasters often portray a powerless people and can reiterate long-term prejudice embedded into imagery and representations of disasters. These framings can serve to victimize and disempower those that live with volcanic risk, as well as inhibit risk-reducing action. While it's undeniable that eruptions can bring about great change to lives, livelihoods, and landscapes, there is still much to learn about how humans experience, understand, and cope with an eruption and its aftermath. And the narratives need not always be about helplessness or hopelessness in the face of terrific geological forces. There's almost always another view. Stories of togetherness and creation of social bonds, which can develop individual and community resilience and support recovery and adaptation. I would argue that these stories of resilience are more media worthy than the other and have a power beyond those that own them. So perhaps one thing we can all do as we learn more about climate change and its impacts is to seek out the stories of recovery and adaptation, not only that perhaps prompt us to make changes as individuals, but also that we may be able to share with others. Thanks for listening.